and welcome back to our leadership series. This is Jose Linares, a Vice President at Leon Medical Centers, and today I'm very happy to be joined by a colleague and guest, Mrs. Bridget Montes, who is the Director of Leon at Home and oversees the day-to-day operations for the home care division for Leon Medical Centers in Miami, Florida. Bridget, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to learn with today's lesson and be a part of it and share our experiences.
Excellent. So as we go through today's lesson, leading through hierarchies and power dynamics, we'll bring Bridget in during the presentation, who's going to review some real world experiences with us and talk a little bit about how she's managed through those very specific situations that I think you'll find you've run into in some way, shape, or form during your day-to-day and with some of your teams. So with that, let's jump right in and begin with today's lesson. What I'd like to do at first is a quick recap. I'm sure that you've noticed by now that all of our lessons are beginning to build off of one and the other, leading us closer and closer to the ideal safety scenario within healthcare management and within our very, very dynamic teams that we work with on a day-to-day basis. So let's start with the beginning, right? So leadership, what does it mean? Well, we discussed in our first lesson that leadership is an act of service. It is an act of serving those who serve others. And we are there to support. We are there to provide resources. We are there to be the backbone of that operation to give those teams that are either directly dealing with our patients or dealing with the teams that are dealing with our patients the very best opportunity to provide the outcomes we're looking for with the highest level of quality and safety. We then jumped right into the psychological safety in teams and why this is so important. The importance of knowing that anyone on the team can speak up, can bring ideas to the table without the fear of being ridiculed or brushed aside or being made to feel like what they have to say isn't as important as what someone else may have to say. And we discussed the impacts of those scenarios. We discussed, the opportunities lost, opportunities for great ideas, opportunities where potentially may have cost us staff if they felt that their input wasn't appreciated and if they felt threatened or they felt that they were being pushed against the wall and not being made to be heard or felt as part of the team. And we moved on to collaboration, teamwork, and engagement. And we focused very much on team composition and how important it is to ensure that as we build our teams and as we look at, in some cases, the teams we've inherited, how do we identify every team member's very unique capabilities, very unique skill set, and how do we best put those together to work fluidly for the best possible outcomes for our patients, for our companies, and for the health of the team. We discussed also turnover and how, unfortunately, turnover has significant impacts on team function and creating, unfortunately, gaps in care. One of the topics that we'll discuss with Bridget as we move into today's lesson. So with that recap, let's jump right in and talk about hierarchies. What are hierarchies? I think most of us see a hierarchy as something very linear. It's the CEO or the executive. Then you have the lower level executives, the directors, the managers, the supervisors, and eventually the frontline staff that tends to be really the one that takes the brunt of the day-to-day. But I'm sure you've realized that hierarchies within leadership teams and within teams of companies can take very, very different forms. Specifically for us in healthcare, a hierarchy in a team could be a senior physician with a junior physician, a nursing staff, frontline support staff, administrative staff. So hierarchies really depend on what the function of the team is. And appropriate hierarchies and well-designed hierarchies lead to very efficient functioning of teams, lead to incredible outcomes. And at the same time, if along that hierarchical line, something breaks, a clear line is lost, then we have, unfortunately, what can be disastrous outcomes in some cases. So what's the intended goal of a hierarchy? Well, the very obvious is to provide order, right? So as human beings, we require a line of succession. We need to know if something's not right, if something's not working, where do I go? And if you think about it, it begins when we're kids, right? So for the most part, our hierarchy at home would be mom and dad, older siblings, maybe grandparents if they're in the mix, and then ourselves as the potentially the younger siblings. In my case, I was actually the older sibling, so I was a little higher up in the hierarchical chain. And I'll tell you that unfortunately, sometimes my position in that chain created some chaos, and it created some division within the hierarchy in the Linares household. A lesson that my parents quickly corrected for me and put me back in line and reminded me of my position among the hierarchy. But it's a clear line of succession, right? So we need to know, where do we go as a child? What if something happens to me, if I have a question, if I get hurt, if I'm hungry, if I'm scared, I know where I need to go. In most cases, I'm going to either go to an older sibling, I'm going to go to a parent, I'm going to go to a grandparent, but I am going to follow a line. Now, there are situations where we jump that line, right? So maybe, as a child, being afraid of the dark and being in my room alone, the first place I would go is to seek shelter in my brother's room, right? In my older brother's room, or my other sibling's room, where we felt that the unity in the numbers helped us against that fear of the dark or fear of the unknown. But maybe if we heard a banging at the window, we skipped our brother's room and ran right into our parents' room as the ultimate line of comfort. That happens to us in our current work environments as well. And even though ensuring that we adhere to the process of succession is important, as leaders, we need to understand that there really are opportunities where that line has to be broken. And that's one of the things that we'll talk about a little later today. But sometimes adhering to the line of succession, though may seem like the right thing to do and the respectful thing to do, could have an unintended consequence because we failed to address a very important topic with the appropriate member of our line of succession. And then finally, the goal here is to delineate expertise. So we talked about not just the hierarchical relationship and line based on position, but also based on knowledge and expertise. In the example we used with the senior physician, followed by the junior physician, followed by the nurse and support staff, et cetera, et cetera. So understanding that sometimes experience, expertise, and knowledge help build a different line of succession and a different hierarchy. And unfortunately, sometimes there, as with anything, there are unintended consequences with hierarchies. And one that we found, and I think you'll agree as you go through your day, lack of communication or communication breakdown ends up being, in my opinion, probably the most dangerous of all breakdowns in a hierarchical chain. And very high level, if you think about that, a break in communication means that someone either didn't feel comfortable, didn't know and was afraid to speak up, didn't know who to speak to, didn't understand the consequences of not speaking up. And unfortunately, in our case, the one who will end up suffering the most is the patient who either didn't receive the appropriate service, didn't receive the appropriate level of care, is the victim of that communication breakdown. So in our readings with Maxfield, they identify communication breakdown as the silence problem, right? So, and it is a problem. There's no question about it. And the biggest question that comes up in all of our minds, and I'm sure that as leaders during situations that we've encountered, we've asked this question of our staff: why didn't you say something? What kept you from understanding that there was a problem, understanding that this problem could potentially create a different problem and have a much greater consequence, but yet you felt it wasn't important enough for you to say anything. So in the readings, we see that, unfortunately, over 60% of healthcare workers fail to speak up about dangerous shortcuts, disrespect in the workplace among coworkers, and sometimes even with patients or customers, and incompetence. I think the reasons are obvious, and the reading specifically calls out fear of retaliation. So that can take a couple forms, right? It can be fear of retaliation from a coworker. It can be fear of retaliation from someone in the leadership chain, from the organization. So unfortunately, it's one of the ones that's out there, and probably one of the most prevalent in our day-to-day operations. The second is futility. So this is when someone feels like they've brought up either the same problem or a problem a number of times without any result or without any impact. So, the person that continuously says, hey, Dr. A continues to send this medication and this dosage for patient B, and during a review of the patient's chart, I see that this is the first medication listed in the patient's known allergies, yet the doctor continues to send this. I've sent various messages to his or her assistant. I've spoken to the doctor directly, and I've gotten no response. And in addition to that, I've spoken to my leader, and I've either gotten, the basic, all right, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it, or, hey, he or she's the doctor, they know better, let them make the decision. You just do your job and bring it up. Unfortunately, as human beings, we end up falling into that pattern where we say, what's the point? I bring it up, I'm worried, I'm concerned, and nobody does anything about it. So in the best case scenario, nothing happens in terms of anything, to the patient. And the employee just learns to live with it and continues to chug along and do their work. In the worst case scenario, you do have an impact to the patient. You do have an adverse outcome with that patient, and you lose the employee, all because someone chose not to listen, not to act. And the last one is lack of real or perceived support from leadership. So we touched a little bit on that a couple minutes ago, but in some cases, we as leaders may not, it may not be a big deal in the big picture. And though we know that, and we know how we're going to handle it, we kind of give it back to the employee as saying, don't worry about it. Not a big deal. We got it. And not necessarily the right response, right? So if someone on your team felt it was important enough to bring something to your attention, and honestly, we have to look at also the level of intensity that person brings when they bring us that concern or that question. If someone felt that much intensity and that much passion to bring something to you, listen to them, walk through scenarios. If you feel that it is not an emergency or something that is of great consequence, talk through it, walk through it with that team member so that they understand why it is that in this case, you're not going to push something up versus another scenario where you may push something up. Some ideas on how to do that. So let's pretend that employee A brings you a problem, and they say, Jose, I'm working on this order, and I noticed that the doctor continues to refer to this patient's son, but in the note, it says that it's the patient's daughter who deals with all of the patient's situations. Well, obviously, there's an issue there, right? So there's a communication issue, potentially between the patient and the physician. So we may not know, one, if the information on the chart is accurate, right? We first have to assume that the physician just had this patient in front of them, just had a conversation with this patient, and may have been told, doctor, that changed. My daughter or my son is now the person that I deal with. So what are some things that we can walk through with our team member? We can say, well, did you speak to the physician? No. Okay. So why don't you call the physician and make sure that nothing has changed? Make sure that the patient didn't tell the physician in this last visit, hey, doctor, I want you to talk to my son. And the physician just hasn't gotten around to asking the administrative team to make the change in the patient's chart. So that way we understand, one, is this accurate? And two, we now have a second action that we can take to assist that physician in correcting the issue in the chart and getting the right information to the administrative staff. So we listen to our staff, we walk through the scenario, and we helped with them to deduce what the issue was, and was it an immediate fire that needed to be put out, or something that just needed to be clarified with a physician, versus the example that we discussed a few minutes ago, where the physician continues to order medication for a patient, and the medication is listed at the very top of the patient's chart as one of his or her known allergies. Now, obviously, this is a little bit of a different conversation, because now we're not talking about contact information. Now we're talking about potentially questioning a doctor's clinical knowledge or their clinical decision with regards to their patient. So we can take a step back, if we go back to our previous chart and look at the order of hierarchy. Now we're talking about expertise, right? So we're talking about how do we address in that hierarchy that question from our staff with respect to that physician's expertise or that clinician's expertise. So how would we address that? Well, I think the first thing that needs to happen is a little bit of research, right? So challenge your team member to go back and identify how many previous opportunities had arisen where that physician had made the same recommendation for that patient. And the reason I say that is sometimes we, as human beings, we're very good at telling the fishing story where I caught a fish that was this big, but in reality, the fish was this big, but I know that this wasn't going to get your attention, but this was. So our staff sometimes find a way to get our attention by saying, oh my goodness, every time he writes an order, he does the same thing. Well, take that with a grain of salt. This may be the first time that person sees that from this physician. They may have PTSD from a previous order from another physician, but in this specific case, this is what we're dealing with. And that's another very important detail. Are we talking about a right now situation, or are we talking about an assumption based on something previous that we've never spoken about? So we go back and do the research. We find out, you know what? Jose was right. This physician in the last 2 months has written 3 separate orders for the same thing. And each time when the physician's been called on the question of allergy, he or she has rescinded that order. So now we have a little bit of a different problem, right? So now you're faced with Jose, who's a little frustrated because not only does he continue to identify what can be a significant problem for this patient, but because Jose continues to read and does the research that he was asked to do, he identifies that this is not the first time, and that every time this is brought up, the physician makes a change. Now, this is the perfect scenario where Jose's done the research, identified the issue, and presented Bridget, his manager, with the issues. Now, Bridget's opportunity is to take on this information and look on her side of the hierarchy and determine where does she go next with this, right? So thank you, Jose. I have this from here. I'm going to move on. Now, Bridget needs to make a decision. One, do I have a relationship with this physician, and do I feel comfortable having a peer-to-peer conversation, even though from an expertise standpoint, we're not peers, but from a leadership standpoint, we are, because we fall within the leadership hierarchy of the organization. If the answer is yes, then I have to assume that Bridget would pick up the phone and call Dr. A and say, hey, listen, doc, I think there may be a mistake. Is there potentially is someone on your team scribing these orders for you, and they're misinterpreting, or they're they're copying something from an earlier note. You know, I want to make sure that you're in a position where you don't find yourself in trouble or where something doesn't happen to our patient. If that's the case, I think 9 times out of 10, you'll have a physician that'll say, you know what, thanks so much for catching that. I missed that. Things are crazy. My medical assistant, God bless her, she's trying to do the best that she can. She pushed the order through, and thank goodness that somebody caught it. Thank you very much for your help. The flip side could be, Bridget, I respect you. Thank you so much, but you're not a doctor. You have no idea what you're talking about, and I would appreciate it if you didn't get involved anymore. Now, Bridget has 2 routes she can take there, right? She can retreat and say, meh, you know what? Doctor's problem. I brought it up to the doctor's attention. I wipe my hands of the situation. Good luck, and I hope nothing ever happens. Not exactly the scenario that we'd hope for, right? Not what we would expect from anyone in a healthcare organization, and much less from a leader within that organization. So Bridget now has to once again look at her hierarchy and say, all right, so where do I go next? Do I go to my next level and let that person have peer-to-peer with his or her peer or counterpart? Or do I skip a level and address it directly with his or her counterpart? I'm going to tell you that there isn't a perfect answer to that one. Depending, as a leader, depending on where you feel the heightened importance is on this matter, this may be one of those cases where you have to hop the chain and you have to go directly to that person's leader, to that person's direct leader, and say, listen, this is not a clerical error. This is not a an address situation. This is a potential medical error that will bring harm to this patient, because this isn't number 50 on a line of in a list of 50 allergies. This is number 1 on the list. And the perception of the response I got from the physician was an inappropriate one. In which case the expectation would be for the leader to act. Very easily said, much more difficult to do. Why? For the exact reasons that we just listed in the silence problem. Fear of retaliation. What's this doctor going to say to someone else about me, about my skills, about my ability? Is this doctor going to poison the well with the other doctors that work at the company with me? And every time I pick up the phone now to say something to a doctor, I'm going to get the cold shoulder, or I'm going to get the silent treatment because I'm the one that, that made the statement or said what needed to be said. Could be out of futility. Maybe Bridget's had to do this a number of times, and she's just frustrated and tired of continuously repeating herself and bringing with the same sense of urgency or with a sense of responsibility that she felt was appropriate. So all opportunities that we could be confronted as leaders, and why it is so important, for us to have not only a clear hierarchy, but respect and understanding throughout that chain and that hierarchy, so that we don't find ourselves in these situations. So with that, I'm going to give you guys a break from listening to just my voice, and I want to bring Bridget in to talk about a couple of very specific examples of things that she's encountered with her team recently, unfortunately, and what the issue was, how it was brought to her attention, and what are the steps that she had to take, not only with her superiors, with other departments within the company, and with her own team, to help bring the situation to a close, correct it, and put in a process to make sure that we weren't in the same situation again. And then once we talk to Bridget, we'll talk about some other examples of impact and what the Maxfield document says about some of those examples. So Bridget, thank you so much for taking time out of what I know is a very busy schedule to spend some time with us and give us some of your expertise on the matter of leading in today's healthcare environment through hierarchies, which I want to say, you probably have some hierarchies among your staff. Forget the leaders, just among your team that's out there talking to patients and doctors and processing orders. you may have some perceived hierarchical lines that have been drawn even among them.
Yes, we thank you, Jose, for having me. We do have that issue every single day. We do encounter those issues with doctors where we're not questioning an order. The order might not be. We need clarification on it, and we do have those conversations. And for the most part, they're really good. But we do have the instances where it could go the other way. As far as the silence problem, one of the scenarios that I had recently, when employees take shortcuts and could potentially harm a patient, we had an employee who received a call on a service for a patient because she decided to take a shortcut and didn't filter through all of the patient's orders. She immediately diverted to the original order of the patient, processed her service, and driver proceeded to do the service as indicated on the order. We got a call from the patient the day after. The patient was advising us that he was having trouble, or his therapy wasn't, the therapy was not sufficient. So when I heard this, normally and regularly what would have happened is somebody would have proceeded to send another person there to service that machine, and it would have gone from there. One of the things that as leaders we have to do is we have to listen to the issues. What are the concerns? Instead of fixing it right away, we fix it right away to help the patient, but in order to correct it. When I started looking into it, I realized that the employee went ahead and did a service on a different unit than the one that the patient was concerned about. The unit was exchanged, therefore causing the patient not to have the proper therapy. What we did in that case is we had an in-service immediately to ensure that all employees understood that a therapy could be prescribed to a patient initially, and 2 days later that therapy could change. We have to pay very close attention. But this employee was known to cut corners. Everybody knows the employee cuts corners. So what we did was we addressed it. We explained what a potential harmful scenario could have been for that patient to correct it. And ever since, thankfully, we haven't had that issue again, and employees are looking at the orders correctly.
So Bridget, and thank you. And that's a great example of taking dangerous shortcuts. And I've had the pleasure of working with Bridget for many years, and one of the things that helps her and her organization is the adherence to policies and procedures. Bridget learned early on in her career that in healthcare specifically, and really in life, obviously a little less rigid in some cases than others, but in healthcare, policies and procedures are extremely important. And in some cases, more so the procedure itself, because it delineates the exact steps that we are required to take in order to service our patient correctly, to get the outcome that we're looking for. And in the example that Bridget discussed, the shortcut taken by this patient, which, Bridget, if I'm not mistaken, this is a long-standing, long-term patient. This is someone with over 20 years of experience
Yes,
in this
sir.
field, right?
Yes, sir.
So, the patient, the employee, in an effort to speed up the process and try to get, and God bless her, the patient his or her service as quickly as possible, she didn't follow the process. And by failing to follow that process, she missed that the last time we had spoken to the patient, there had been a change in therapy by the patient's physician. We had acted on that change in therapy, and that's the specific issue that the patient was having. So by reverting to what she thought was the right place to go, again, not following the process, she created a situation where, one, the inappropriate level of service was given to the patient. The patient had to call back and let us know, hey, something's not right. I'm still not feeling how I should be feeling. And we had to dispatch a person out there again to solve the problem and take care of that patient. So we had a few breakdowns, right? So one was a breakdown in communication. And that breakdown was in the communication between leadership and the employee. Leadership has been very clear. For this particular type of order, these are the steps. And it's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's not 1, sometimes 2, maybe we can skip 2 and 3. It is 1, 2, 3, 4. So the employee chose to skip steps within the process, breakdown of communication. Second, breakdown in communication. Patient didn't, the employee didn't confirm with the patient. The patient probably would have clarified for her exactly what was going on, when the last time was he or she saw their physician, and what changes potentially were made to his or her therapy, and probably forced her to dig a little deeper, and she might not have skipped the step that she originally skipped. And then third, she created a situation for the patient and for the company. So she jeopardized potentially the patient's health. She caused a discomfort to that patient unnecessarily, and she created an additional burden and expense for the company, and potentially impacted other patients because we ended up having to derail from a regular day service to take care of this patient who we should have been able to take care of on the first visit the day before. So, perfect example of how a dangerous shortcut can lead to a problem in quality of care with a patient, and at the same time creates a little bit of chaos within the organization, because multiple people may be required to repeat their jobs because one person failed to follow the process, and no one spoke up, and no one has spoken up. We found out because the patient called us. So a great example on how taking those dangerous shortcuts can create a problem. So I know there's another example because Bridget's had a very exciting month. So the next one I think is a little more serious in nature, and it goes to something else that I think we deal with on a daily basis. So take it away, Bridge.
Yes, one of the biggest things that we as leaders have to do is we have to audit. Unfortunately, there's so many moving parts, at least in this industry operationally. It's very difficult to be able to touch 300, 400, 500 orders. I, as a leader, like to do a lot of audits. I come in from the weekend. I sit on Monday. Before I start reading my emails, I kind of see what the weekend looks like so that I can see if there's any things that are off. I could trend if there was any increases in orders, or if I could see something that potentially doesn't look right. In the middle of those audits, I noticed an order for a service of a piece of equipment that was left open. It just said open. It didn't look like it was processed. It didn't look like it was completed. When I proceeded to call my dispatch team, and I asked them, I said, hey, is there a reason why this order was left open? Was it taken care of over the phone? Because it's not closed. They look at it and they tell me, no, this order is still open. Nothing's been done with it. So I bring in the two team members that were here on Saturday, and I brought them to my office, and I said, I want to ask about this order, just to see if anything happened, because there's no communication, there's no notes on the order. I just want to make sure that I just don't leave this order as open. I see that there was an order to take care of something, and it wasn't closed. One of the employees speaks up and says, oh, that was me. The other employee looked a little bit nervous. The one who did the order said, oh, that was me. I guess I forgot it was there. And I proceeded to tell them we have to be very careful with these orders, because obviously if a patient calls in and needs something the same day, we have to take care of it. Make a long story short, I proceeded to do an in-service to make sure that I created audit points to make sure that those orders didn't get left open again. The other employee, the one that seemed nervous, came to my office. She closed the door and she says, look, I don't want to get in trouble for this, but I am going to speak up now, because I am not going to get written up because of this. But the employee that did not complete the order came into work. He came in 20 minutes late. He had his legs on top of the desk. He slept under his desk. And he left early. He disappeared for 3 hours, and I was in a little bit of shock. And I'm like, so if I put on my cameras, she says, yes, please look at your cameras. One of the reasons why I don't look at the cameras in the morning is because I believe as adults, we all come here to work. I shouldn't have to babysit and look at the cameras. But when I checked the cameras, sure enough, the employee got here 20 minutes late. He proceeded to walk around the department. It seemed that he slept under his desk for about 30 minutes. And he disappeared for 2 hours. And as we concluded with the audit, Obviously the employee is no longer employed here, but because of his failure to want to work, I asked him, I said, why did you sleep? He said, well, I wasn't feeling good. And I said, well, why didn't you call out? That would have been a lot better. You could have potentially put a patient in harm's way. He said, well, I just didn't think that you would look at the cameras. So unfortunately, that is a real life situation that did happen to me about a week and a half ago. And that is why we always have to be auditing, checking. And the funny part, it's not funny, but the weird thing is this had been happening for weeks now. When I addressed his feet on top of his desk, he says, well, this is not the first time. If you check the cameras, I have my feet up many times on the weekends because this employee was a weekend employee. So needless to say, we are auditing a little bit closer, but because he came in, there was no leadership here. He felt that he can do what he wanted, and the for me, the most frustrating part was there was other employees here seeing that. There was more employees in this department that were looking at that, were seeing with them, and nobody spoke up. And if the audit wasn't performed, something could have happened to that patient.
Yeah, and Bridge, it's crazy that, when we think about it as leaders, and you brought up the point, these are adults, right? These aren't children. These are people that, have been given a responsibility. They're here every day. They have an opportunity to speak to our patients on a daily basis, to hear the condition of these patients, and in some cases, the desperate need, sometimes just to talk to somebody, other times to receive whatever it is, whatever the item or the service is that was prescribed by their physician. And even in that case, the level of disrespect, because I think this falls perfectly into the category of disrespect. This is not an incompetent employee. This is someone who knew exactly what he was supposed to do, exactly how to do it, but he chose, primarily because he felt like it, to do his own thing, and to take advantage of our trust as leaders, to take advantage of the organization and the resources that we provided, and behave in the way that he did. And the sad part is, as you mentioned, is that we've had a handful of employees here every week that have worked with this employee, saw what was going on, knew what was going on. And interestingly enough, it wasn't until you called two people in, happened to be the two people working that day, you brought them in for an audit, and one of them realized, uh-oh, if they keep digging, I'm going to get in trouble. I better speak up. So in this case, fear of retaliation, futility, perceived support, all that went out the window, and self-preservation kicked in. And thank goodness that it did. And we were able to address the situation, identify that it was an ongoing issue, and do two things, right? So one is correct the immediate problem, which was to separate from this employee who obviously did not have the same desire to serve and to do the right thing for our patients. And two, and I think almost equally or more important, was to regroup with our team and explain the importance, first of all, of just respecting one another and respecting our patients and the freedom that they have been given to be in the office, to be working without direct supervision on a weekend, but respect to each other and to the other employees that are here, that are working with their patients, that are dealing with the same things. And unfortunately, we're probably picking up the slack for this person for weeks or even months before the situation came to a head. And, they were put in a position to basically fess up. And I agree with you that the situation wasn't funny, but you never expect the response from an employee that you got to say, oh, go back and check the cameras. I bet you're going to see my feet up on the desk every time I was here. I mean, it makes you wonder. So, this goes beyond disrespect. This is just a callous, complete disregard for anything that's appropriate, specifically in the workplace. So, Bridget, thank you so much. I mean, these are two great examples of what happens every day. And I'm sure that all of you have some of these examples. And, I'm going to challenge you to think about two cases in your recent or sometime within the last 6 months, situation at work where you found yourself in a similar scenario, where you found yourself identifying where an employee had taken a shortcut. And when you really started to peel back the onion, you realized, oh my goodness, we have a very, very deep problem here. It's not one employee taking shortcuts, it's other employees picking and choosing which, steps and processes to follow and potentially creating a problem. And what opportunities for disrespectful employees, whether it's, direct disrespect where someone's speaking inappropriately or mistreating someone, or disrespect like we heard in Bridget's example where, the employee wasn't being rude and he wasn't speaking inappropriately to other people. He was just being disrespectful to the work and to the patients and to the company by his lack of action and by some of the actions that he took. In the Maxfield paper, we look at the numbers of respondents, and in concerns about dangerous shortcuts, 84% of the folks that were part of these surveys and observations said that they work with someone who takes shortcuts that could harm patients. Think about that. That means that 84 out of 100, assuming that 100 is the number, 84 out of 100 people are taking shortcuts in dealing with patient care. So let's pause for a minute. And I want that to sink in because, percentages are tricky, right? And we say, well, it's a small group of people. Unfortunately, when you look at numbers this high, it's the old where there's smoke, there's fire. And, you're talking about, assume it's 84 people that take one shortcut a day. So that means that 84 potentially dangerous shortcuts are being taken by a healthcare organization on a daily basis, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Do the math. How many opportunities for errors? How many opportunities, God forbid, for potential patient death? And what's as alarming, if not more, is less than 50% of the people who say they have a coworker or someone that they know that takes shortcuts said anything to a manager, and even much smaller percentage than that addressed the person themselves. So this person has now, unfortunately, become complicit in this act, and it falls into the category of the undiscussables, right? Where it's not a simple mistake where, oh my goodness, I forgot this step, I went back, I corrected it, and everything's okay. It's not. This was a calculated decision not to say something. So I saw the problem. I realized that it was not a one-time thing, because I am saying that 84 times something is happening. And then I made a conscious decision not to say something. That makes us complicit in the same thing. And similar results when we talk about disrespect. 85% of the people that were spoken to in this paper said that they work with people that demonstrate disrespect. There were different levels of disrespect. Some of them is the language that they use when they speak to one another. Other one was, body language, disrespect for work. So different levels. But again, 85 times out of 100 in a day, some act of disrespect is occurring. And again, less than 50% brought this up to a manager, and less than 25% brought it up to the person who was being disrespectful. Sadly, in this particular case, almost 50% of the people agreed that the disrespect was causing problems. So, we as leaders are, I think, if we look on a daily basis, we're outnumbered, right? So there's one of us against, and I don't mean against, I mean, there's one of us and 50 of them, right? Them being our subordinates. That's a lot of people to have to manage. And my team hears me say this over and over again. The moment you have to start managing a person, whether it's because of disrespect, because it's lack of following a process, you really have to start honing in on whether or not this person needs to be part of this team or should be a part of this team, right? Our job is to lead, to inspire, to serve, to educate, to support. to help them bring their ideas to life. If we have to manage them on a daily basis, on the most rudimentary of tasks, on things that they should have learned at home or in elementary school, such as disrespect, aside from perpetuating the problem, we're taking time away from our patients. We're taking time away from the staff and the employees that do care, that want to spend the time doing things right. And we're potentially creating a lack of real or perceived support for those that are doing the right thing, that are following the rules, that at some point are either going to start questioning themselves and say, why do I do this? Why do I work as hard as I do to follow the rules, to follow the process, to follow the steps? And here's this other guy who never follows the rules, who says whatever he or she wants, and my boss does nothing about it. The last one is incompetence. And this is probably, for me, it's one of the scariest, right? The other things are easily addressable. Shortcuts can be addressed, as Bridget mentioned, with in-services and re-instruction. In some cases, it could be, we've been doing something for such a long time, we get into a pattern and we get really good at doing it. So we're like, I can skip that step because I do this, I know this like the back of my hand, and it's, it flows. That's something that can be corrected. Disrespect can also be corrected, right? So at the worst extreme, separation from the employee. At the best, an honest conversation, which is, one of the interventions that we have to discuss, which is addressing the disrespect immediately, right? The first time you hear about disrespect as a leader, everything has to stop. You need to bring the people in that felt disrespected, the people that were affected by this, and you need to bring in the person who's creating this environment, because this will not get better by itself. It will get worse, it will deteriorate, and unfortunately, sometimes it will come to a head where it's an altercation between employees, not necessarily physical, but a verbal altercation, and again, the patient's going to be in the middle. It is our responsibility to stop these things the minute that we see them happening. Incompetence is a little different, right? There is no policy on better skills. There is no policy on education, on knowledge base to do what you're doing. You're not going to have a home health aide suture a patient because she was the only one available to stitch up this patient who was bleeding. No matter how well-intentioned, no matter how skilled she may be or he, there's just no expertise there. And that's a very specific example. When we look at incompetence, we also look at people that were potentially hired in desperation because we were super short-staffed and we had to put some people on the line. And, as time goes by, you start to realize, oh my goodness, everything that we spoke about during the interview, everything that was in that resume, it's not really panning out. We're not really seeing the skills that you said you had, but we ignore it. And we say, you know what? I can't do this to my team again. I can't short them one more person because it's one less person in the on-call rotation. It's one less person to answer phones. It's one less person to deal with issues. And if I do that, they're going to freak out. I'm going to lose people. Huge mistake. And I'll tell you that early on in my career, I learned it from one of my, my first bosses, and he drilled it into everyone on his leadership team. Never, ever, ever be afraid of being short-staffed. That is why it is so important for us as leaders to know the jobs of the people that work for us. Obviously, for those of us that are not clinicians, the limitations begin once the problem becomes a clinical problem. But outside of that, we as leaders should be able to fill in, get up to speed on the role of any one of the members of our team so that we never feel like we're being held hostage by an employee. That unskilled person, that disrespectful person, that person that continuously takes shortcuts even after they've been addressed and educated, that's not the person you want on your team. And that's something that has to be addressed immediately to ensure that you don't have greater fallout and greater impact to your team and eventually to the organization. So we've talked about few things in regards to hierarchies and cultures of fear. We've talked about the instances of silence, conflict avoidance, discomfort in speaking up. We had the example with Bridget's employee that was worried, about speaking up until he or she felt that their own job was potentially at risk, and then the need to speak up became clearly evident. That's a very extreme example. You could have the example in the case of a physician or a junior physician where, I am the junior physician. I am so excited that I got on Dr. A's rotation all through med school. All I could think about was working with Dr. A. He's been the eminence for 20 years, and now I'm on his staff, and I start to see some things that are a little alarming. So first, I question myself. Is it me? Is it a lack of knowledge? He's the higher up. He's the expert. He's probably figured stuff out that's not in the books. Maybe yes, maybe no. But still an opportunity to potentially have a conversation with that peer, with that superior, to ensure that you're doing the right thing, and that this is part of a new learning process and part of a new opportunity. Having on your team, familiarity, which we talked about in a previous lesson, where the team's been working together for a while. They know each other. They know who does what. They know each other's weaknesses, each other's strengths, and that has helped create a strong voice within that team where they feel comfortable speaking up because they know that Jose's not going to take it the wrong way. He knows I know what his weaknesses are, and so does he. And I can directly call him out, and he's going to be okay with that because we have a good relationship and a good line of communication. So that's a very important part of building our team and ensuring that we build that culture of familiarity and that voice that is so important, specifically in healthcare. And obviously, we talked about reducing the fear, right? We talked in a previous lesson in multidisciplinary teams. We talked about the fear of a non-clinician voicing an idea on how to treat a patient to a clinician, and how you have to create an environment where, though my idea may not be rooted in the clinical knowledge that you have, but it's rooted in common sense. It's rooted in what I've put together from looking at this patient's chart, from talking to their primary care physician, from talking to a family member. So I may not have the skill set that you have, but I have the information, and you have to be open to listening to that, right? In order to give me a voice and help me feel like I am part of this team and I am part of the solution. And then, we have to have targeted interventions when something happens, when we have those situations where there's a concern or there's potential, fear among the team. We have to intervene. It's our job as leaders. The first time we hear an off-the-wall comment, the first time somebody jokingly says something, we need to dig, because people don't joke about being disrespected. People don't joke about unskilled staff members on their team. People don't joke about the doctor who constantly writes orders for a patient who's allergic to product A and continuously writes orders for product A. That is a subtle way of bringing a potential problem to your attention as a leader, and the expectation is that we do something about it. And this becomes even more important when you have new people on your team. Whatever behaviors those people see from existing staff and from you as the leader, I promise you, they are going to mirror. And sooner rather than later, if there was some bad habits, they are going to surface. And you're going to have a honey of a time bringing it back, because you've allowed certain behaviors to fester over a period of time. And this person doesn't know any better. They don't know the culture. They haven't been here long enough. They don't know the dynamics of the team. They don't know that Jose's weakness is that he giggles when he does something wrong, or he's known for shortcuts, not because he's a bad guy, but because he likes to get things done and he likes his productivity numbers to be high. And though he's really good, but he makes a lot of mistakes. Those are the things that we have to watch for. And, peer support is very important. Let's go back to the example of being at home at the very beginning of our stage of life, learning what a hierarchy is. our peers at that point could be our siblings, they could be cousins, they could be, any number of people that we consider our equals and the ones that we would bounce things off of. We looked for approval, we looked for support. I can tell you in my personal life, I'm the oldest of three, and my younger sister and my younger brother, throughout different stages of their life, always looked for my approval. In some cases where they really didn't need it, I don't think they ever really needed my approval for anything, but it was more of a show of support and a confirmation that whatever I was thinking was on the right path, that I was, okay and taking the step that I was going to take. So we look for that among our peers. As leaders, we look for it among our direct leadership peers, and we look for it with our bosses as well, right? We look for that. Our staff looks for that as a team, and they also probably look for it from the people they serve. They like to hear from that patient, "Oh my God, thank you so much. That's exactly what I needed. I've been waiting for that." It's not, a peer, so to speak, but it is a confirmation that what I did was correct. It was appropriate. It was necessary at the moment. So the more we can do as leaders to create that opportunity for our teams and to create an environment where they feel comfortable and they support each other, my goodness, the impact that those teams are going to make is spectacular. And selfishly, it is going to make your job as a leader so easy, because the expectations were set correctly, the foundation was set correctly, the parameters were set, the line of succession is clear. There aren't any unnecessary filters in between the different levels of hierarchy, and everybody respects one another so they can have conversations and disagreements, which are so important. My goodness, some of the best ideas that I've been, privileged to deploy have come from disagreements. And we joke about it now among my group of my direct reports and I, we laugh and say, "Oh my God, you're always turning down my ideas. Oh my God, you're mad at me. I'm not fighting with you." And it's because we've become familiar and we know each other well enough and we respect each other enough to say, some of those things, knowing that I'm going to push certain buttons, and they know I'm doing it on purpose, and they know that I'm doing it to generate a response, and they know that I'm doing it because I know it's a trigger for somebody, but it's a trigger in a good way. It's one that's going to generate an idea or a thought or a new process or a new way of doing things that, had I not pushed and had I not really put them up against the wall, they would never have said it. Why? Because it's easier to go with the flow and keep things status quo so nobody gets upset. Sometimes I'm a little tired this week, I don't want to get more work, and this guy and his ideas are just going to create more stuff that we're going to have to do. So it's our job to push those barriers and get the response that we're looking for. And as we wrap up, we're back on psychological safety. Incredible, huh? We've come full circle, and rightly so. We started off talking specifically about psychological safety, and I hope you've seen over the last 3 sessions how psychological safety isn't just a buzzword, right? It's a way of being. It's a way of directing your teams. It's a way of preparing yourself for the day. It's a way of preparing your teams for the day. It's a way of preparing your teams for difficult times. Listen, I've been a leader. I've been blessed to lead great people for well over 20 years. And I have to tell you that in 20 years, not one day has been exactly like the other day or the next day. And it's probably one of the things I love the most about being a leader and about being blessed and privileged to be in this position. I am constantly challenged, constantly challenged. I am challenged to speak up by my peers and by my teams. I am challenged to bring fresh ideas. I am challenged to keep them engaged. I am challenged to support them. I am challenged to listen to them on a personal level when things aren't going right. My decency, my humanity is challenged on a daily basis. How I react to what may seem insignificant to me, but carries so much weight for the person who's discussing it. And I'm going to leave you with an example, with a story of something that happened recently that, shook our team a little bit, because anytime someone that we care about or that we respect is in a difficult position, it puts us, it reminds us about who we are and how things can change in our lives from 1 minute to the next. We recently had one of our employees, a clinician who's been with us for almost 10 years, spectacular human being. In this case, a single parent, someone who works hard, the person that always raises their hand, the person that always gives when you think there isn't another ounce to give. They somehow find a way to squeeze one last drop out and give. And this person, due to a personal event, had their world rocked a little bit. And after the initial shock, I think for everyone kind of wore off, we saw this team, this familiar team that's taken almost 10 years to put together, with the right people from our line staff to our leadership team to everyone, come together in support of this coworker, this peer. And it was personal support, it was professional support, it was moral support. I'll tell you that one of our team members even took this person into their home and is taking care of them as they go through this difficult time. It was so humbling for me, not only to hear what my staff did and the fact that they immediately took the schedule, divvied up the work, made sure that all this person's work was up to date, but from the patients and the families of the patients that this person cares for. If you ask her, she'll tell you that it's humbling and a privilege for her to serve a very specific patient that she serves. And she does it with love, and she does it with affection. So much so that when I had to speak to that family and let them know that for a little while, this person was not going to be a part of caring for their loved one, the immediate response was, what can we do to help? How do we help this person? And in some cases, I tell you that would have come from a place of selfishness and needing. In this case, it didn't. It was a genuine, heartfelt, what do we do for this person? And that goes to the quality of the human being. It goes to the quality of what that person does. It goes to the quality of what that team does. And I credit the leaders that directly lead those teams with that response. Bridget and other leaders on that team that are the ones that create the support, create the environment, are the backbone, have created that environment of family, of trust, of appreciation, made a very difficult situation significantly easier for this person, and hopefully showed how important it is that even at work, these teams that we call teams in these lessons are really families. And when you start seeing your team as a family, you don't have to talk directly about psychological safety. You don't have to talk about hierarchies. You don't have to talk about feeling a certain way. All of those things will come out, and they will be evident in every single thing that we do every day. So thank you very much. Bridget, thank you so much for two great examples that went directly to today's topic. And I don't know, you seem pretty light on your feet during this, so I think we may have to tap you again in future sessions to talk a little bit more. So thank you once again. I appreciate your time, and until our next lesson, take care.
Absolutely. Goodbye, everybody.